With me now is journalist and author Naomi Klein, whose books include No Logo and The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism. Naomi, thanks so much for joining. I really appreciate it.
Glad to be with you, Chris.
So you wrote this excellent book that a lot of people have read, but maybe some of our, not all of our viewers have, called The Shock Doctrine. And it's funny because I've seen a few people recently talking about how what's happening in Wisconsin, they were skeptical of your thesis before, but what's happened in Wisconsin is making them a little more receptive to it. So I want you to describe what the thesis of The Shock Doctrine is and how it applies in what we're seeing play out in Wisconsin.
Yeah, the thesis of the book is that the right-wing policy playbook is tremendously unpopular in a lot of places, particularly when it involves rolling back benefits that people have fought for. You know, everyone likes a tax break, but people are going to protect hard-won public services, public benefits, labor rights. And so what I argue in the Shock Doctrine is that if you look at the 30-year history of the triumph of these policies around the world, what you see is that their great leaps forward happen during times of extreme crisis. And that's because in a time of crisis, you have politicians able to do exactly what Scott Walker is doing right now in Wisconsin, which is say, the roof is falling in, we have a state of emergency here, we don't have time for democracy or public consent or deliberation or collective bargaining. So it becomes an opportunity to ram through these unpopular policies, many of which he did not campaign on. He campaigned on the popular stuff, the tax cuts, but he didn't say how he was going to pay for it. And so, lo and behold, you have a budget crisis. You exaggerate the extent of the crisis, and you say, we don't have any alternative but to push through these very unpopular measures. And part of that really means constricting the democratic space. And that's why I think it's so significant that they're going after collective bargaining, because it isn't just the particular rollbacks that they're offering for. They're trying to reduce the ability of participation of the workers in their own futures. It's a constricting of democracy. So it is pretty much a classic example of the Shock Doctrine. I have to say, I don't take any joy in being right about this, but you know, I end the book by saying that the way you resist these tactics is by understanding that they're happening while they're happening. Because the reason why these tactics work is because when you do have an economic crisis or another kind of crisis like a natural disaster or even a war, people are terrified and they tend to put a lot of trust in their leaders. We saw this after 9/11. What's happening is in Wisconsin is an excellent example of what I describe as shock resistance, because people are naming this while it's happening. They're saying you're manufacturing a crisis so that you can exploit it. And the other thing that they're doing is they're talking about all the other ways that you could fill that budget shortfall besides this very narrow vision that we're seeing. And you know, this is a challenge to one of the original shock doctors, Margaret Thatcher, whose famous phrase was that there is no alternative. What we're seeing is people very loudly talking about the alternatives that are available.
In just the last 60 seconds we have here, I wonder if there are connections you see between this. There's been a lot made of the connection between, the people in the streets of Cairo, and I think maybe that connection is not as robust as people seem to think it is. But there are other places we've seen this kind of shock resistance that can serve as a model.
Yeah, I think maybe better than comparing this to Cairo would be comparing it to the incredible pushback we've seen in the UK and Britain to another anti-democratic attempt to push through very unpopular austerity measures by a coalition government that was not elected to do this, does not have a majority mandate to do it. And what you see in Britain is a very clear attempt to not only say, okay, we don't want our education cut, we don't want our health care cut, which is happening, but more important, you have groups like UK Uncut, which is now spreading to the U.S. A group called US Uncut has cropped up, and they're planning actions on February 26th. And what they're doing is going after the corporations that are not paying their taxes, going after the tax dodgers directly at their storefronts. Companies like Vodafone, Topshop. Today there were big protests against Barclays Bank, and showing that if these corporations paid their taxes, then you wouldn't have to be gutting public services. And so I think that in terms of resisting the shock doctrine, you have to have your own story to resist the panic story being sold to you, and that's really key.
Thank you so much, Naomi Klein. She is the author of The Shock Doctrine, which you should read. She's a colleague of mine at The Nation magazine. Naomi, thanks so much for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Chris.